Earlier, we said ColdBox is a convention-based framework and that it's not configuration-based. That is to say, it does not rely on config files to run. That doesn't mean that there's no way to configure ColdBox. It's just that the basic machinery for your MVC activities doesn't have to be manually written out by developers building applications in some sort of XML file. That part of the code will just work, and that can save some time and boilerplate in your code base. There are settings in ColdBox that can be configured, however, to further customize how your application runs, to enable different features, and so on. These settings live mostly in a file called coldbox.cfc, as you can see it here on my screen. In the config folder is where you'll find coldbox.cfc and several other files that control different settings in your application. This is the main one. This file is one of the things that was created for us automatically when we did the coldbox create command earlier in a previous video. By default, the majority of this file is just a method called configure. You can see that on the screen right now as well. If you take a look at this method, you'll see that all it does is create some variables and assign them to values. Actually, they're mostly just keys inside different structures within that function. There are no if statements or for loops or anything like that. You can think of this method as a giant set of preferences and settings for your application. The contents are similar to what you might find in an application CFC file in a legacy CFML app. But in ColdBox, we've put all the settings here inside this ColdBox CFC and inside the configure method itself. Again, if this were a legacy app and these were plain application variables, you'd access them by using application.variablename. Well, these are ColdBox settings, so we'll get to them in a different way, but they kind of serve the same purpose. There are a few different ways to access these settings in your app. The getSettings method is the first one we're going to take a look at here. You can also inject them with a property tag thanks to Wirebox, but we'll get into that in a later video. So right here, at the top of the component, I've got my ColdBox struct with basically default settings for controlling ColdBox itself. You can see in here there are things like setting my application name, the reinit password if I want to configure that to be something, some different properties for specifying where my views and layouts might live if I don't want to use the default location, things like that. And down here below that is an empty structure called settings. In here I can put things specific to my application that are not really ColdBox machinery, but they're more just settings for how I'm going to run my application. I can go in here and add things like, let's say, company name. Like so. I'll take a look at my application right over here. And we're not going to see anything yet on the screen. I'm on my users list page. Let's go back and take a look at the code again. Here's my users list method. You can see I'm just outputting an array like we had before. I can use the getSetting method and just pass in the key name from whatever I put in that setting struct, and it should draw this on the screen for us. I'm going to go back here, and let's put an abort right after our write dump, just so that we don't have anything else run, making it difficult to maybe find where the getSetting is being outputted to the screen. Load that up, and you can see, oops, something went wrong. It says company name doesn't exist. Well, let's take a look at our code. It does exist. Right there, it's called company name. Anytime you change something in your ColdBox CFC config file, you have to reinitialize your ColdBox application. I can do that by going up here to the URL and adding fw reinit equals 1. It will reload, and there's my company name config setting being outputted to the screen. There's no limit to how many settings you can put in your settings struct here in the ColdBox CFC. It just depends on what you want to do with your application. Here you can see I've got my company name example from before, and I can add company year founded. This one is a string. This one is a number. I can have, an array in here. I can have a list, whatever it is you want to do with that. Over here in my handler, you can see I'm just outputting the array from before to this screen. And here in my list view, I'm outputting the array that we had earlier in a previous video. And I'm also using the getSetting method we just saw to actually output the company name setting from my ColdBox CFC onto the screen. You can see here, when I reload the page, that Vandelay Industries right there is being specified by this getSetting company name call from in our view. So I'm able to grab a setting directly out of our setting struct, and using the getSetting method, I can have it display on the screen. I could also use that to control maybe setting an IP address for a configuration somewhere else in my app. It doesn't have to be a thing that gets outputted to the screen somewhere in your code base. It can be whatever moving part you need to configure. You can just make that a setting, put it in here, and you're all set. These structures that come by default in your configure method, ColdBox, settings, environments, modules, these are what we'd call major directives. These are the core sections of machinery that can be controlled by this configure method in your ColdBox CFC. Notice how this ColdBox one here, all of this was created for us by default just from running that ColdBox create app that we ran earlier. Notice how all of these settings in here, a lot of them are just set to empty strings or true or false. There's not a whole lot of custom settings in here doing anything crazy. ColdBox by design has default behavior for everything under the hood out of the box. You can do ColdBox create app. You never have to change any setting anywhere, and it will run your application just fine as is. You can come in here and change these settings if you want to customize how the application runs, but you don't necessarily have to do any of that. ColdBox machinery is up there in the ColdBox struct. Settings we talked about earlier, these are the custom settings I might want to provide to have certain bits of information specific to my application added here into the configuration. Environments is another one. Environments is where you can control the names of the different servers that are in your company environment, and you can determine whether they are development, staging, production, test servers, or whatever else you might have. So in here you can see environments, it's got one key called development, and it's got localhost and a regular expression for 127.0.0.1 after it. These are both pretty common names for development servers. Let's say I also have a staging server that I want to use for testing my application. I can add another key in here and call it staging and set that to whatever my staging server name is. Maybe it's staging.vandelay.org or something like that. Maybe I have two staging servers. I can simply put a comma between them, and now I can have staging and staging2.vandelay.org, and those will both act as staging servers. If I have a third environment, maybe QA equals, and then put my QA server name in here as well. There's no limit to how many environments you can have. It's just key value pairs. It's just items in your environments struct. I'm going to get rid of these before I leave a typo in my code and cause confusion later. We'll come back to the environments in just a minute. Modules is where you can specify different ColdBox modules to be loaded up when your application starts. Modules themselves are entire ColdBox applications that can live sort of within this ColdBox application that you're working on. Logbox is for controlling the logging settings in your application. If you want to add customized logging settings to something happening in your code, you do that here. Layouts deal with your layout and view options for UI components of your app. We'll get into those in a later video. Interceptors we haven't talked about yet. They're a little bit fancier, so we'll come back to those in a future video as well. You can see there are some other settings that are commented out that we're not going to use at the moment. Other default things that you already have working functionality for in your application, like layouts, naming conventions for what views and handlers are called, and so on. Notice how most of this ColdBox CFC file is one function, configure. That starts on line 4, and it's currently going all the way down to line 135. And I only have a few lines of code left. It's this development method. Remember up here in our environments struct, we have a key called development. The way this works is, let's say you have an application. In a legacy application, you'd have your application CFC file, and it's got all your different application variables in there. Usually most of those would run on whatever environment you're on, your production server, your dev server, your QA server. But occasionally you have things that need to be specific to your dev environment. In a legacy app, you probably have a giant if statement in your application CFC that says something like, if cgi.servername is development, use these variables for controlling my dev server IP address and dev server data source names. Else if server environment is production, use these other variables for my IP address and data source name and so on. You can do that in ColdBox. You could actually go in here and have an if statement pointing to your CGI variables and your CGI settings, configure it that way, but there are better ways that are a little bit cleaner to do it in ColdBox, half of which is this environment struct up here. So you say development, you just come up with a key name. It doesn't have to be development. It could be development, staging, QA. It could be whatever you want. And then next to it, you can list out regular expressions for whatever the servers are that relate to that environment. So localhost and 127.0.0.1 are often your development machines. So we just by default have development in your ColdBox config with those settings. When your ColdBox application first starts up, ColdBox will look in here, find out what server the application is running on. It will look to see if it's got a match in one of these server regular expressions. If it finds a match, localhost being the one that we're on now, it'll say, oh, that's the development environment. It will then jump down here to your development method, and it will run this method, overriding whatever settings you want to override from earlier up here in your ColdBox configure. So ColdBox configure is the giant method that runs first. It includes all the settings for, by default, your production environment. So this will run on your production server as is. Let's say you're on your development environment, and most of these settings are just fine. You want them to still run the same way on your dev server, but there's one or two things you want to override specific to your development environment. That's what your development method will do down here at the bottom. In this case, we're just turning on the better custom error template when you're on your dev server, so you can see more information on the screen about what's actually happening if your app throws an error. When you're on production, of course, you don't want to have a lot of details about your server visible on the screen when an error occurs. You don't want hackers to see all that information. However, when you're on your dev server, that extra information is helpful to your dev team in sorting out bugs. Let's go back up here to our environments. Let's say I also have a staging environment like I mentioned earlier. I can say staging.vandelay.org. All right, if I'm on my staging server, the same thing would work. I can come down here to the bottom of this method, or this file rather, and I can add a method called staging. And then in here, I can put whatever settings I want specific to my staging server. Maybe on staging, we have a third custom error template that we use that is specific to that environment. Maybe I have a staging bug report template that I use that includes extra information about who to email on the product ownership team to discuss, how the staging server is behaving or whatever other customizations you might have for that environment. Notice how I don't have to put all 135 lines from the configure method inside development or staging. All of the code up in the configure method will still run on all of your different environments, dev, staging, production, whatever. After that configure method runs, the method pertaining to which environment you're on will also run, and it will override whichever of those settings need to be overridden specific to, let's say, the dev environment or the staging environment. And that's how you can control your ColdBox application the ColdBox way, instead of doing it the legacy way. If cgi.servername is dev, do this thing, else if cgi.servername is staging, do this other thing. You get rid of those giant if-else statements, and here you have just functions that you call all within your ColdBox CFC method, or ColdBox CFC file rather. The ColdBox CFC file is the main one you'll use for configuring most of your application. It lives here in the config folder. As you can see, there are several other config files as well in this folder. We're going to take a quick look at a few of those. Cachebox CFC controls your caching options in your app. If you've included any sort of caching mechanism, you can go in here to Cachebox and use this to customize turning that on and off, toggling some different settings. You can switch between different cache providers if you want to get really fancy with your application and do that sort of thing. By default, it just does what it does off to the side. You don't have to touch Cachebox if you don't want to. Don't worry about what the settings do in here if you're not really dealing with a cache engine of any sort. It'll just stay disabled and out of your way. Router CFC controls different routes. These are basically the different patterns in the URLs in your application. So you can have search engine friendly URLs, you can have custom URLs where maybe you say /sales and that actually goes to something other than the sales handler internally in your app. We'll get into specifics with what the router CFC can do in a later video. You can sort of think of it as similar to the URL rewrite engine in IIS or your URL rewrite options in Apache if you're familiar with those sorts of things. And Wirebox also has a configure method in it. You can see similar setup to ColdBox CFC. Wirebox is for controlling the Wirebox functionality in your app, your dependency injection and aspect-oriented programming layers of code. And again, by default, it stays out of your way. You don't have to touch anything in here if you're not really using it. But when you do start using some of the dependency injection features in your app, it's helpful to know about this file. You can go in here and set things like the location for which folders to scan so it knows where the components live that you want to make Wirebox aware of so it can load them up and provide AOP functionality, automatically do bean management and auto-populate some components for you, things of that nature. You'll do all of that from here in the Wirebox configure file. If and when you get to that point. Again, if you don't want to use Wirebox, if you don't want to do custom routes, if you don't want to deal with Cachebox, All of this stuff is totally optional. It's there for you when you want to use those features. And if you're not going to use them in your Coalbox app, they stay completely out of your way. And again, remember, if you change anything in your Coalbox CFC, you need to restart your application. You do that either by adding fwreinit to the URL up here. The other way you can do it is by going to your command box prompt and typing Coalbox reinit, and that will restart your application for you as well. They both do the same thing.